Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we convene our third of 5 programs on the very important issue of artificial intelligence and how we can, at this moment, implement regulatory guardrails that will protect humanity from the negative potential side effects of a technology that has so much promise and will play such an extraordinary role in future human progress. Before we delve into that subject, I want to bring everybody up to speed on the genocide that's going on in Gaza. As I've said a number of times, it is essential that humanity not look away from what's taking place in Gaza, because what we're seeing 24/7 on live TV is the genocide of a defenseless people. I've pointed out that what we're witnessing now, after the Israelis have essentially carpet bombed all of Gaza, remembering that Gaza is only about 5 miles wide, about 25 miles long, nestled right there near the Egyptian border with Israel on one side and the Mediterranean Sea to the west, with 2.3 million inhabitants who since many, many decades and officially since 2007 have been essentially constrained in a concentration camp that is now the longest enduring and largest populated concentration camp in history. 2 million of the 2.3 million Palestinians are now packed in southern Gaza, having been told by the Israelis to leave the rest of Gaza to avoid bombings. And as they've been leaving, they've been bombed. And over 100,000 of them, mostly women and children, have been killed and wounded. It's the largest mass killing of civilians and women and children in modern times. At one time, 4 months. And now the Israelis are beginning to intensify the bombing of Rafah, where all those people are congregating, all of whom are hungry, many of whom are starving, disease breaking out, no more anesthesia in the hospitals of the few hospitals that continue to function. I saw in the news last night that babies now who require amputation of their limbs are being amputated on without anesthesia. Just imagine that for a moment. What I want to draw people's attention to today is the testimony of a single Israeli soldier, Ariel Bernstein, who served in the Israeli Defense Force, who served in Gaza and in the West Bank. And I want to tease out a few points that he's been making as he, almost alone in Israel, except for a few compatriots, speak out about what's taking place. One of the things I learned in listening to his interview was the distinction between what the Israelis have been doing in the West Bank and what they're doing in Gaza. In the West Bank, it is, as he put it, metaphorically, he said, when we were sent in to the West Bank to terrorize the people, because they have a policy in the Israeli government and in the Israeli military to occasionally what they call mow the lawn, or they just come in and terrorize, just to terrorize. In the West Bank, he was the captain of a small little company of soldiers. And when they mowed the lawn, they would go in at night and just randomly knock down doors to houses, destroy all the furniture, get people out of bed, maybe beat them. And if they resisted in any way, particularly the men, they would be arrested and taken away without charge. And some of them are still in incarceration. In Gaza, he said, it's completely different. In Gaza, everyone is considered a terrorist. So you don't knock the door down. You just blow up the building. It doesn't matter who's in it. The more, the better, because they're all terrorists anyway. And he made a point that is worth observing. He says the strange thing as a soldier was that there's no military targets. There's no military targets in the West Bank. There are no military targets in Gaza. Hamas has a few rifles and a few rocket launchers, which they keep hidden underground and then pop up and shoot them and then go back underground. They don't have tanks. They don't have an air force. They don't have military bases. They don't have infrastructure. So the only thing that the Israeli army and air force can do, having no military targets, is just to destroy any kind of infrastructure. The hospitals, the schools, the UN agencies, the ambulances, the museums, the mosques, the churches, anything that constitutes infrastructure is a target for destruction, including the water supply, including the few desalination plants that have been built to provide water in Gaza. It's worth just noting that right now on a daily basis, and the reason why there's so much famine and starvation is for 2.3 million people, the Israelis are only allowing in 30 trucks a day. And many of those are detained by the protesters that have been allowed into the truck crossing point by the Israeli army and are being used by the Israelis to block as many of the trucks coming in as possible. It's very important for us all to bear in mind that before October 7th, 500 trucks were allowed into Gaza every single day, in accordance with the doctrine, the governing doctrine of the Israeli military, starting in 2007. We're borrowing from what the Germans did to the Jews in the 1920s and the 1930s in the work camps. They allowed just enough food in to keep the Palestinian population at just above starvation. A human being needs 1,200 calories a day. They were allowing in per capita 1,400 calories a day. Candy wasn't allowed, sugar wasn't allowed, any kind of high caloric food wasn't allowed. And because it was a concentration camp, there's no way for any of the Palestinians in Gaza to get out or in, except for that small group that were allowed to go work for the Israelis. The point? To do, again, what the Germans tried to do, use the work camps as death camps, where you basically work people to death. And in this case, you starve them to death over time. So right now, as we speak and we sit in our comfortability, let us bear witness to what the Israelis are doing to the Palestinian people as they mass in Rafah, the last remaining place in Gaza that hasn't been completely bombed to smithereens. It's hard to look at it, I know. But bear witness, we must, to one of the great crimes in history that is not only happening before our very eyes, but was happening with the full military, economic support of the US government. Now we'll turn to our subject for today, which is on artificial intelligence. And as I've mentioned before, and I'll say it again as we talk about these matters of gravity, that consciousness is not siloed. The same consciousness that would transact genocide in Gaza is alive and well in the development of artificial intelligence. In fact, as you may know, the Israelis are using artificial intelligence right now in Gaza to maximize the number of people that they kill and the frequency of their bomb attacks. And so the issues that we raise at this moment in history, my friends, are serious issues. That's what Humanity Rising is about. And as I've said before, sometimes we rejoice, sometimes we celebrate, sometimes we mourn, sometimes we learn. And sometimes, as we've been doing for the Palestinians in Gaza, we simply bear witness and take a silent stand. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Tom Eddington, the convener of our program, who will commence our program. Thank you, Tom.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. And as always, thank you for your opening comments. Each program that I have an opportunity to share the broadcast with you, I'm always struck by what you bring into the conversation, I'm always moved by what you share and the perspective that you hold, and I'm grateful for who you're being in the world. So thank you, Jim. I think part of picking up on your comments, part of what I would like for us to focus on today is what Jim was just sharing. We see a centralization of power over other. And with our conversations this week on artificial intelligence, we're seeing a tremendous amount of power being concentrated in the hands of a few. And when we look at our economic systems around the world, capitalism in particular, it's very much concentration of power in the hands of few. And as John Perkins, author of Confessions of an Economic Hitman, has coined it, we have been living in a Frankenstein capitalism system for decades now. It's nothing like capitalism as it was originally defined. And capitalism is informing and in some ways influencing and directing the creation of artificial intelligence. And it's with that context, I'd like to invite our panelists today, Flor Schukking and Philip Mucci, to join us in conversation around artificial intelligence in this capitalistic system, and specifically to the question of is it even possible to have ethical AI in the capitalistic system that we're operating in? So welcome to you both. I look forward to our discussion today. And Flor, maybe starting with you, if you could share just a little bit about your perspective on artificial intelligence and the ecosystem that it's operating in and will be operating in the future.
Understood.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, please go ahead. All right, it was Flor or Phil. I couldn't quite hear. My apologies. Go ahead, Flor.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you, Tom, for the introduction. And also, again, Jim, really, I'm so glad that these kind of things are shared in here before we are starting the conversation. But for my interest in AI and what I've been working on in my research is how AI is really embedded in and also rooted in a neoliberal or capitalist system. And if you look at all the different facets of artificial intelligence, so from where it's being applied, who's getting funded for it, where does money come from, what kind of projects they're being used on, but also just the way that these technology is being shaped, just on the data level, for example, how data is being used, how it's being gathered, but also just in the mathematical structure or how these models are being shaped. You can also see sort of social economic thinking aspects back into the way that these models are made. So I think really from the bottom up, all these sort of aspects are sort of rooted within, like on a fundamental level within AI. And what I'm curious in my own research is if you would go from this, but then from all different kind of perspectives. So maybe it's from a degrowth perspective, or from indigenous wisdom, or from a feminist perspective, and you would build it up from these values or from these worldviews. What would it look like? And would it even exist? Would it be useful? Would it be ethical? And it's really a personal question for me as well. Like, can we make something like this that's based on an aspect of intelligence? Because I think what is being seen as intelligence within AI currently is very, very small, very limited. But also for me, it's a very personal question. Like I'm not sure what the answer is, if it will be there, and it's also what makes it difficult to do research on this.
Thank you. Phil, any opening thoughts from you?
Yes, thank you, both of you, for your introductions. In approaching the question about whether it's possible, I try to think about equivalence relations, and in terms of what is already existing in our system of capitalism that we would view as, let's say, extremely unethical, or as close to the line as ethical as we can, and draw an equivalence to the appropriate or lack thereof use of AI in other scenarios. And Flor and I spent some time talking about that yesterday, because in trying to define what's ethical in this case, we have to sort of define a rather broad view of something that one set of people could agree on, right? And AI itself is in the business of minimization of a mathematical curve. And we spent some time talking about this yesterday. And is the action of minimizing to a curve itself an unethical operation, right? And so my question is, can we find analogies in today or tomorrow's technology that we've learned to live with and drawn appropriate boundaries around? My gut feeling is no, we've just let everything be the Wild West. It's clearly that capitalism will not self-regulate, to me as a computer scientist. But that being said, we've learned to live with a lot of things that are either state-sponsored or government or personal, that are just highly unethical in the choices we make on a daily basis. And where in there can we find room for AI, in addition to what can we do with AI to, from a mathematical and engineering standpoint, to ensure that there is at least a doorway for ethics to enter the conversation. No, that would be my opening comments. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Phil. Any reaction to that, Flor? Phil's comments?
Yeah, and I think it's really like maybe focusing on this sort of ethics side of it, like, and I think it's also sort of the question with regulation, like something that I often hear, well, the genie's out of the box and you can't stop it anymore. So while it's there, let's make it as ethical as possible. Yeah, and this is also the difficult part because you need to work on it and you want to work on this ethic. There's so many things you need to unpack about it. And also there's so many ways of thinking that you just need to be aware of to make it. So if you start think about all these ways that sort of capitalist thinking is sort of you're unaware of, but there's some values in there that you maybe not be aware of, but then you're putting this in the system, or the things that you may be focusing on. It's just so much for like an AI developer that's maybe not has learned that much about ethics during their education. It's a lot to unpack, and those are the people that sort of making these kind of algorithms and models. And I think it's not like with a bad intent. I think they're doing, or I hope that they think they're doing a good thing, but I think it's also just part of not being aware of all these kinds of things, maybe. And then also the thing, maybe you're aware, but then how do you then continue with that? So maybe you're aware of these things that might be wrong with it, but there's not a clear answer for how to then cope with these things.
Yeah, thank you both. I mean, I think it's important for us to have context for this conversation. And I'll speak from an American and U.S. perspective, and would appreciate you both, Phil. While you're American living in Sweden, you've got a way of seeing the world, and Flor from a Dutch perspective. And so I'd like for you to sort of add an additional dimension. But here in the U.S., we have a situation where government is no longer running the agenda of the world. Commercial interests are running the agenda. Here in the US, it's expected that for a presidential election, for example, it's President Biden and former President Trump each are going to spend about $2 billion on their campaign. And they rely on and need money from individuals who will help shape and influence the decisions they make as president in the future. Our legislators are very much in that same situation where they're having to raise several $100,000 a day during their time in office. And so they're heavily influenced. And historically, government here in the US has always been reacting to industry. So industry is driving the agenda of the world. And when it comes to AI, by and large, the people who are developing it don't have a tremendous amount of life experience. And so whether it's the ethical perspective that you're speaking to, Flor, or other perspectives, and then we can speak to neurodiversity and where do people sit on the neurodiversity spectrum, and how much time have they spent outside the US? To what extent do their values reflect the values of citizens of the world? And so we're ending up with a technology that has extraordinary capability beyond any other technology that's been created by humanity, being driven by a very few set of people. And it's the potential for harm far exceeds, from my perspective, the potential for good. And we'll be talking tomorrow about how the technology is and can be used for good. On Friday, we'll be speaking to what does it mean as an adult to be raising children and parenting both the technology and the children who are the first generation to be growing up in an AI world. And so there's just a lot there, and I'd love to engage you both in this conversation around in the context of how AI is being developed. Is ethics even possible? Yesterday we spoke to, we probably have missed the opportunity to create guardrails And so I'd love to hear from both of you what your thoughts are on that. Or if you'd like to start.
Yeah, so with on the part of on sort of creating these guardrails for AI, that's what you mean, right?
Yeah, both the guardrails and also ethics and compassion. Or, is it asking too much? Is it even possible to have an ethical AI, a compassionate AI, a regulated AI?
Yeah, I think it's very, very difficult, at least also if you already look at the scalability of AI, like the kind of energy or resources it needs, or the kind of like the raw materials that you need for just the computing power of some of these big AI systems from big corporations. They demand a lot of energy, a lot of components, and these are also always so at least for the components, they're from the global south, and I think it's really sort of fitting in sort of the current capitalist society where some part of the global south are being used or exploited to sort of delve up these minerals. So I think already just with the kind of scale and the type of computing power needed for AI, I think that's already a question, like, can you gather these minerals in an ethical way? I think that's already something that needs to be, like, from the start. It's already difficult to do this because these minerals they're scarce and these mines are not operated in an ethical way. And I think there it should already be started. But that is, of course, not only AI, but just technology in general, often needing these kind of materials. But that's some aspect of it. And then you'll even go to sort of the way data is gathered and how things are sort of measured and operated, and to sort of the application part. There are so many aspects that if you want to make it truly ethical, there's so many things that you need to focus on. And that's just difficult for me to just pick one thing and then sort of go from there. Yeah.
I can add a comment to that maybe. And I mean, these days, and I'm assuming everybody's aware that a lot of the technology is open source. The things that are hardest to deal with, that require the most work, are the data sets themselves when you're first generating a model. It is, I mean, to a certain degree, the power has been decentralized by the fact that you can now talk to Google Vertex, for example, and it will spit out Python code for you to interact with a language model, right? But what the challenge there is that the data sets to generate those models are really only in the hands of the big players. Now, there are lots of them that are open, but to actually deal with them, you need to have access to a large amount of computing power to boil down the model that you can deploy in small things. That is, however, one of those areas of computing that is changing rapidly. So I think we'll see over time that training these large billion parameter and trillion parameter models will become more and more accessible to smaller and smaller players. And a thought that occurred to me earlier when we were talking about sort of the blind spot that developers tend to have when it comes to bias or when it comes to ethics or how the data might be used, is that maybe we need to teach more humanists sort of the aspect of how they can learn to program in machine learning and whatnot, and deploy the tools that way, and come at it from an empathetic and essentially an ethical standpoint, working backwards as if they're learning a new tool, as opposed to an engineering standpoint coming from it that it says, I'm using this tool to solve a particular problem, like recognize faces, right? And that in and of itself, it's only as ethical as the problem it's asked to solve and the data set it's been given. But maybe it's a rethink of who we're putting into play to develop these solutions when, pretty soon it's not going to be required that you need a PhD in computer science or a master's in computer science to do nearly any of this. It's really going to be piecing it together, provided you have a representative sets of data to train on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really, really important aspect to it as well. But something that I that I wonder on is like if it's if it's more accessible, and I think in ethics wise it's a good thing to have something that's open source, to have it available to as many people as possible. But I think what it's sort of creating is what you see now is that AI is mostly used in an economic context. So it's very much about efficiency. So maybe more people can more easily create data and more programs and et cetera, but like who's benefiting from that? Is it really those people that can then access these models, or is it corporations that can benefit from the extra output of these workers that are now more efficient? But I'm doubting if it's like that we would be able to work less, or if we just work the same but then do more in the same amount of time. And yeah, I'm not sure if people are actually benefiting from that themselves. You might feel more productive, but I also would like to question, like, is productivity the thing that we want to value the most in our work or in what we're doing a lot of our life when we work?
Yeah, picking up on something you shared, Phil, I was in a meeting with a president of a liberal arts college last year. And, one of his challenges as president of the university is having course offerings that 17 and 18-year-old kids want to study. And he has, a situation where there are, at this particular school, a handful of students who, and I'm talking 2 or 3 or 4 students who are wanting to major in philosophy. And he's had to find a creative way using, an open sourced education platform to provide a degree in computer science and coding. And so the quote unquote pipeline of talent coming into the workforce who are, educated in philosophy, in the humanities, in the liberal arts, we're seeing here in the US more and more small liberal arts schools going away because they either they can't attract the students or can't keep the students there because the job opportunities, the opportunity to make money. And so that, where does that philosophical, ethical, moral training values come from for the people who are entering into these roles and into the labor pool?
It's a really good question, and I admit that I was raised in a bubble where my values and ethics were sort of determined by my parents and peers. And being educated as an engineer, I thought that was sort of somewhat universal. And then you go out into the world and realize, no, it's definitely not that, the same forces are at work everywhere. It just depends how much support you have to combat them. And the problem you mentioned, Tom, is 3 times worse in, shall we say, developing countries or places where they're headed directly to the job market, focused on income and revenue and hireability, where any course that is even remotely not that is tangential to what the ultimate goal is generally thrown out, and that's a real shame because that's exactly how I think that's probably the crux of the question is how do we steer that from not happening, right? Can we produce computer scientists with a sense of conscience? In the long term, can we produce engineers with a sense? I used to think that was true, and then Facebook and everything else came along, right? So the question is, where do we start? And it has to be from some other beginning, I think, other than I'm getting paid to solve a problem.
Maybe picking up on that, Phil, you've spent a lot of time in Nepal. What are you seeing there, just on a personal level? And how is it shaping and influencing the culture there?
I would say on average, the population is very interested in tech. They are pretty good with their smartphones, and they tend to adopt stuff rather quickly. As far as putting it like sort of AI into practice, for the most part, what we've seen is a couple of sort of offshore companies help with data gathering and data filtering and sort of those type of jobs coming to Nepal, but no real wave has come through there as of yet. I mean, it's a country that focuses on trying to make sure all citizens have a job. It's where it's made a lot of strides in that regard. You know, at the moment, it seems like it's still cheaper to open offices there than it is to automate with AI. But there are entrepreneurs themselves who are looking into how do they benefit from this. But I think that's the question, is that in a what seemingly more gentle culture, ultimately the business climate is just as capitalist, if not more so, than us in the West. You also know I do a lot of work with a company that makes software for microfinance loans. And I was begrudged to find out that the owners of every microfinance bank only do so because of as an investment resource, not out of altruism, interestingly enough. So the underlying factors, I think, are still in play, and it's not clear that even a drastically different cultural and religious background can make a difference from the powers of capitalism.
Or with you know, some of the conversation we had in preparation for this program today, you know, you've got an interesting background, not just in you know, your interest in AI, but from a humanistic perspective. Where are you in terms of your hopes, your dreams, your thoughts about what's possible with AI, and how can we use it for the benefit of humanity?
Yeah, I think you might have asked me this as a difficult week for me personally. Yeah, I for me it's like going up and down. At some weeks I'm optimistic and I think, well, let's just try to sort of find all the aspects of AI that are so enrooted in a capitalist system and try to really find something for the better. And then other weeks where I'm pessimistic and I hear all these sort of AI for good projects where I think, well, this is not for good if you really think about it. Not just like in the current time, but also like in sort of the future, the kind of directions that we're going into. And that's also something that I find difficult in that sense. And I'm still hoping that there's some type of AI, and I say some type of AI because I think the kind of intelligence that's now embodied in AI is sort of a Homo economicus side of model of intelligence, so very much rooted in a neoliberal way of seeing people and seeing how we are intelligence, and not something that's sort of maybe rooted in a sort of holistic way of seeing intelligence, or maybe consciousness, or however you want to call it. But then again, it's like, do we want to create something that's not sort of shifting the attention away from ourselves, like how we are maybe able to find ideas and come up with solutions, or do we really want to strive to make something with a model or with some sort of framework that's maybe not even like on a technical thing, but just like a model? And is that sort of the future that we want to strive for? Like, is that sort of if we look at like 100 years from now, is that the thing we want to focus on, or do we want to focus on other aspects that could make us more of a conscious society? And for this week, I'm more focused on, well, maybe we should just not do it. Or maybe it's not like, yeah, I think it's sometimes sort of a technical fix for things, and it's better to fix things at the root than sort of trying to fix them with technology or with a type of AI. So I sometimes find it difficult to sort of think what kind of direction I want to go in there, personally, at least.
Yeah, I mean, for me, as I've been engaged in this conversation over the last year or so, it's becoming increasingly evident that it's time to take a pause in the development of AI and ask some fundamental questions. But I don't get any sense that anyone is prepared, or at least anyone in a position of power, whether it's people developing AI or from a regulatory perspective, anyone's prepared to take a pause and ask some fundamental questions, as we discussed on Monday. What does it mean to be human? What, are we developing AI as in access to information? Are we developing augmented intelligence to support the development of the human species? Or are we developing artificial intelligence that's creating this confrontation between silicon sentient beings and carbon sentient beings? Phil, I'd love to get your thoughts on, is it even possible that a pause could happen, and what is the future that is being created?
Yeah, interesting question. It's for the biggest companies, it's possible that a pause could in some way happen, but as you said before in the previous session, the cat's out of the bag. This technology is now everywhere, and you can train models on your phone, or it's not export controlled. So it's already in the hands of the bad actors as well as the good ones, if any of us can be categorized as good. As far as like evolving intelligence out 100 years, we're still so far away from that. The concern, though, is that the data set that we will ultimately train whatever AI we have on is a data set that we've created, and is essentially the history of humanity as it exists in the digital universe, right? And that data set is full of pretty horrible lessons about us as a species, as individuals, as human beings. So my concern would be more so we need to fix the data set for whatever AI we're going to invent in the future is. And because 100 years from now, I mean, it's not a matter of will it happen. It's going to happen. It's inevitable. The question is, are we going to be training it on a data set that is essentially representative of a capitalistic system where inequality, is a virtue of the system, and not a detriment, and it's necessary for the survival of some, is the suffering is necessary in others. This whole balancing of the equation and optimizing for what is the right answer. And so that's pretty frightening. And I don't know how we do that other than make sure we have a better 100 years in front of us from a capitalist standpoint than we did behind us. But there's no evidence of that either in today's. So I think in general, the output is quite bleak if we get to the point to say, okay, everything that's available digitally will be incorporated into a model in some form, way or another, and we'll be able to ask it, what is the worth of a human being? What do we think about, these questions that we can only pose in sort of thought experiments, but it might have an answer. And clearly, if given control of things, if you ever give it control, that's where things can get scary, I suppose.
So
the data set is what we've done to ourselves and to each other in the past 100 years is going to be a reflection of what AI could do to us in the future, essentially.
So who would need to be at the table, and what decisions would need to be made to alter the data set?
Well, I think essentially the organization you founded here is a way to alter the data set, right? If every year that goes by, there's more material about how the world is growing more together, and we are solving our problems in nonviolent, confrontational ways, et cetera. So the data set in that way is one that you could say doesn't exist yet. And so, the question is now, if we're training it over, particularly history, and there's so much conflict and so many reasons for conflict that, but I think the data set, I mean, we could go back and try to edit one, right? And then it comes into the fact of, is this ethical by us editing out the horrors of our existence and how we are to each other, versus can we train on a set of data that's more human-based and more representative of the ideal we are aiming to move towards, right? Of course, we're seeing the tide in the US and other places against movements like that, like diversity and inclusion, things like this. They're working literally against woke models. Elon Musk has a model that he claims is anti-woke, right? And what he's done is he's stripped out what little empathy exists in the data set in the first place. So the best thing we can do is work on solving the problems around us on a daily basis, and that becomes the data set for tomorrow's AI. But that's a generational question, not about what do we do today, because that data is already out there today. Most of it, you can have access to, and it's getting more. And I would believe in the next 5 to 10 years that most of those large data sets will be completely open, in order to sort of guarantee some transparency about how certain models have come to what conclusions, right? Because they're going to eventually have to trace them back to what data caused, what training set caused this decision to be made, especially if the decision is wrong.
Yeah, I think that brings up an interesting observation from me, is that for humanity, particularly in 2024, we're living under a narrative of the true nature of humanity, that we're a violent species, that we can't help ourselves, it's survival of the fittest, a misappropriation of Charles Darwin's writing and work. And we need a different story about the reality of what the true nature of humanity, that we're hardwired for collaboration and cooperation, and that of the 8 billion people on the planet, well over 7 billion are living in some level of peace on a daily basis. But that's not the narrative that we hear from the media. That's not the conditioning that we've grown up with. And so what I'm hearing, Phil, is that true story of humanity needs to be integrated in the data set, and that narrative of who we really are needs to be integrated in. And I'm wondering, for both of you, where and how does that happen?
Yeah, I think that's also an interesting thing. Like on one side, I think it's very important to have like these data sets and have them as diverse and as open, and as many minorities and as many people incorporate in that. And also, indeed, with what you see, like there's a lot of thinking of people like, yeah, we are bad, like as a person, while a lot of these things are a very small minority of people that actually did these very bad things, and some people followed, but then it's just like a very small amount of people that are actually causing these things. But then going back to sort of this creating this all encompassing data set, I think it's very like even sort of trying to take all the aspects of life, or from ourselves, or from humanity, or nature, or just how broad you want to take it, and then trying to sort of fit them into these categories of data. Like they're fixed, they're just categorization. You can make it as specific as possible, but then you're still sort of trying to categorize and figure and pick up aspects that make us human in a sense. But I think it's also sort of missing this sort of more difficult to grasp aspects of life that are not really easy to pack into a sort of a data set, or a number, or a certain type of text. Perhaps I think like more on an emotional side, for example, or from an intuitive side, or a feeling side. Like it's sort of feeling that's sort of fitting into the idea that we are completely rational beings, and is for very much like we are our brain kind of thinking. And I think it's not us, but I think also a lot of things in nature, that it's not only about our brains, like there's a lot of different aspects to it as well. And I think sort of this, I'm not sure if it's possible to sort of take this all into account and make one big data set of it, because it's sort of making us and life sort of fitting towards a computer, or something that a computer can sort of use. But then we're trying to model ourselves to this machine. And I think that's also some sort of weird thing that we're trying to do.
I wanted to also throw in on that floor, Tom, you also asked the question about sort of you mentioned that, sort of at any given day, there's, lots of horrible news articles about the behavior of people on the planet, or what's going on, but yet there's many billions of people who are not engaged in that type of behavior. And that it occurred to me to connect it to the previous point, which is that in and of itself is the data set right there, right? We don't have 7 billion articles about a neighbor being nice to his neighbor, or we have 500 million articles about a murder, a conflict, an abuse, a pollution, etc. Right? And we've monetized that. We know how that works, whether it's ethical or not. We've monetized that type of media, and that is the echo chamber of that, which becomes the training set. There's, and so it'd be interesting to think like, okay, of the billion articles that we're going to train a large language model on, what percentage of them are human beings we could make some generalization about human beings being good to each other or the planet versus being bad. And so, maybe that's one of the answers to your question, is to start recognizing that the majority of data that's out there, aside from the scientific data, if we're training on, Twitter and everything, I mean, we're literally trained on everything that's there, is that it is it's an over-representation of who we are, and not a good one. I wanted to also respond to Floor's comment about how we take into account sort of feelings and these sort of non-numerical quantities. We talked a bit about that yesterday. And, I believe there will be strides in the next 10 to 15 years that fundamentally work in slightly different ways, but are still limited by the bounds of mathematics. And particularly, I mean, sort of, whether it's feelings or intuition or a host of other talents, be those otherworldly or not, they can affect the outcomes of the human machine, right? And anything, if we believe that we should be able to model anything, that eventually we'll be able to account for that in some way. There's evidence that says we'll never be able to account for consciousness. It's probably a quantum process. I think that's probably true. But nonetheless, this essentially temporal variance that human beings have in their thinking. You ask the same question twice, you'll get a slightly different answer depending on what mood we're in. And I think there'll be a way to encapsulate that. The question is, do we lose a reliable partner in AI once we start encapsulating sort of the human condition, which is, no, I want this AI to give me the same answer all the time versus I want this AI to give me an honest answer, right? Anyways, just those 2 points. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. Floor, what else is there for you in this conversation?
Yeah, something with the like maybe perhaps the way that we are interacting with sort of this potential better type of AI. Like, I think maybe it's also good to sort of define a bit what type of AI we're talking about, but sometimes we're talking about a very big data set that is encompassing everything, and sometimes we're talking about very specific things that maybe an LLM or something or a deep learning model can already, some parts of it maybe do already. But I think it's also sort of sometimes the idea that a model can do it better than ourselves, or like if we have a model that will tell us what the solutions are, what the good answers are to a difficult problem or whatever. Are we going to sort of, if we have that, are we going to sort of do that, or do we still think that we can do it better ourselves? And is it okay if we think that we can do it all right? And is this sort of striving towards this type of AI that can sort of better our working, or let's do things better? And what is better in that sense? Is this sort of being more precise, or being more objective, or more rational, or however you want to call it? Is that the way that we want to make our decisions, to be completely rational? I think sometimes it's good to make rational decisions, but I think a lot of the decisions are also not rational, but are maybe compassionate decisions or something like that. And do we need then to make an AI that's compassionate, or do we just need to think about how things are being done in our society in the first place? And of course, these things are very difficult, and I think that's why it's also maybe easier to think, well, let's fund this AI project that's going to solve this for us, instead of sort of fundamentally thinking about how things are rooted in our system and sort of acknowledging that things are may be wrong in the way we think, or that we have certain biases in ourselves. Perhaps it's easier just to have an AI system that solves for us for this. But then can you really solve it if you can't really acknowledge this in yourself, that you're having these kind of biases or these kind of different things? And I think that's also sort of what makes it difficult for me with AI. Like, we can do all these things, but shouldn't we focus on how we do things ourselves and then figure out how we can do things better without using technology, for example?
Yeah, I mean, we'll get into some of this in tomorrow's session, but I was speaking with a CEO of a technology company in Silicon Valley last week or week before, and he was sharing an initiative he's working on of integrating nonviolent communication training into an AI technology that would be integrated into all of their digital technology. So sitting here on Zoom, for example, that as a person is sharing information, they're getting real-time prompts privately from this AI that's trained in nonviolent communication to encourage them to maybe rephrase or to reflect or it would be real-time coaching in nonviolent communication, or in a text on their phone, that when they get a text from somebody that might have them react rather than respond, they get a prompt from an AI that encourages them to, think about, how do I respond to this from a nonviolent communication perspective? And so, I have those conversations, and it leaves me feeling incredibly hopeful about what the technology could provide us with. But to both of you, the comments you've made, we're working with a large language model or with a database that includes all information, or potentially all information, that doesn't offer that kind of promise.
I was smiling only because it feels like that should be my wife sitting over my shoulder saying, "Hey, don't respond to that text message." Thank goodness. Being Italian, being of Italian descent, I need that app big time. Interesting. Yeah, we need those hopeful stories, Tom. I think that's probably what's missed a lot in the headlines, because these days we know for sure that scammers and everybody like that has already deployed the technology. Military's already got their hands on it, but we need some good news out of it. And there's a lot of good news to be had for reducing human error. Floor asked, okay, there's a lot of cases where AI is just going to be a lot better than a human and it's in healthcare, it's in other areas. It's basically pattern matching. That doesn't mean they're good at the human interface to healthcare, and those individuals will still be necessary. But at the same time, there's a price to be paid for this development. We talked about that the loss of jobs, right? And maybe we'll talk about that at some point. But I wanted to bring a question to the table, which is, in thinking about the evolution of the technology, I often, again, try to think in parallels, is that you sort of, from a mathematical standpoint, sort of the AI model training is rather ruthless. And from maybe, 10,000 meter view, one can kind of view it in terms of evolution. And if one were designing a process to better a species, you sort of think about, which is evolution itself ethical? Is there any portion of capitalism that is essentially ethical, or are we trying to fit a square peg in a round hole in this particular case? Because there's always a winner and a set of losers, and there's exceptions like genetic altruism and how that plays in, and could that ever come out of a large language model, for example? But I'm interested in those questions.
Mm-hmm. How about for you, Flor? What questions have you curious right now? Where are you in all of this?
Yeah, so what I'm also interested in is that if you if you have a system that's not a capitalist system, or maybe, so what I'm currently focusing on a bit is on if you have a socio-economic system that's in degrowth. So if you have a system that's not focusing on increasing GDP, but on other aspects, so for example, welfare or enjoyment or things like that, like a completely different type of society where you, I think it incorporates from a lot of different kind of aspects into this sort of degrowth model. But what kind of AI would there be? Like, would there still be this incentive of creating AI and making AI if from the start of like the way we do our education, if it's more regenerative, more focused on well-being of other people, of equity all over the whole world, if the global south doesn't get exploited, if we sort of decolonized our whole thinking, would there still be the sort of drive to make artificial intelligence? Would we still want to do this, or is it just like a product of our capitalist, neoliberal sort of innovation-driven future that we just learned so early in life, maybe? And what type of AI would there then be? And would there be a type of AI, or could you have a nature-centered AI, for example? And I find it quite difficult to sort of imagine these types of aspects or types of AIs where you would have them if there wouldn't be so many jobs that people will do because they need money, or but truly choose because they have the possibility to do that. What would there then be? I find it difficult to imagine how it would be different than if there would be. So, for example, if you have this a nonviolent communication app, I think it's a really nice example. But would there be an app for that if there's a society that's not sort of what our society is now, or would we have maybe someone, or would we all just focusing on collective healing and learning how to communicate with each other? Or is this sort of a weird utopic dream that's not realistic? But what type of AI would there be then, and what kind of aspects should it incorporate?
Yeah, maybe picking up on a couple of threads that you both have shared, and I'll go back to the U.S. for a moment. So half the Americans who have ever lived in the United States since the creation of the U.S. are alive today. And over the last century, most of the Americans have moved off the family farm and into urban areas, into employment off the family farm. And we now have 2 or 3% of the US population working in agriculture. And the term job is only a couple centuries old. And so when looking at that, looking through the lens of that historical perspective, this world that we're currently living in is a unique phenomena in human history. And are we at that point where we could have a paradigm shift, a major shift in how we exist on this planet as a species? And what might that look like? And how could AI, or how will AI either force that or support that?
Yeah, and I think then it's really important to sort of really be able to see what kind of AI technology is there now, and is it sort of driving us toward a more capitalist society, or can it also be used to sort of steer it in the other direction? And what I think now it's very difficult to sort of imagine. I mean, it's also because we don't have examples of at least as far as I know, we don't have that much examples where it's like that. And I think it's with a lot of things, like we don't really have examples of other futures, like most of the futures that we sort of seen a lot, like in movies, in sci-fi, it's all very quite pessimistic views of the future itself. And so it's also maybe more difficult to sort of then imagine how this sort of process would then be towards a better society or a better more holistic or compassionate or wise society, however you want to call it. Yeah, but I think now the current with LLMs and how these are sort of what you see a lot, like learn now how to use ChatGPT or otherwise, you'll lose your job in the future. Like it's all very sort of panic driven maybe, and a lot of individualist, like you personally need to learn this, or your job will be replaced with someone who does know how to use it. So I think it's a lot of values are just being incentivized right now, and yeah, how would it be different to steer it in the other direction?
Any other thoughts from you, Phil, before we invite Jim back into the conversation?
No, I think Floor's kind of summed it up. I think, the one final thing I would think is how you deploy this type of more equitable AI that Floor is mentioning. And part of me wants to see it, available in conjunction with some, minimum guaranteed income that a couple of countries have experimented with, right? Like, if we believe that AI can only ever be as good or as bad as the capitalist system itself, I don't think there's any evidence that technology will steer us towards the better, right? We thought Facebook and ubiquitous messaging would bring us together. It hasn't. It's divided us. This technology is probably no different. So you have to start somewhere, where there is already an overwhelming sense of ethics and values that is somewhat counter-capitalist, right? And whether it's Christiana in Denmark or somewhere else or some small city that's experimenting with it, but it has to be. I don't think there's any evidence that this will get used for good.
Welcome back, Jim.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Philip. Thank you, Floor. Very thoughtful conversation. What was coming up for me that I'd love to have you both discuss is a comment you made, Floor, in your initial remarks about, the cat's out of the bag, the horse is left the stable, and there's not really anything we can do about it. That's the prevailing worldview. And because of that worldview, nothing is done about it. And what I want to bring in is that this notion that the cat is out of the bag and there's nothing we can do about it is what neoliberal capitalist economics is all about. It is not the truth of the matter. It's a worldview that's been so deeply inculcated into the public consciousness that we believe it's as true as the law of gravity. And because we believe it's true, we don't question it. But it comes at extraordinary variance to how people live in their ordinary lives. I may have a negative thought, let's say about Tom. Tom does something and I have a negative thought and I want to kind of do something. Well, I think about it and then I start to realize I don't want to do that, even though he's done something to me. And that's replicated throughout the human realm. So people all over the world, all day, are in fact putting the genie back in the bottle. That's called civilization. And I would draw from Carl Jung here, who defines civilization. He says, is the thin veneer humans construct in society to keep at bay our atavistic impulses, right? Is what we're trying to do in Gaza. We're trying to put the genie back in the bottle by having a ceasefire. So history, society is replete with bottles, genies, genies that get out of the bottle, and genies that are put back in the bottle. So I just wanted to bring into this conversation, since we're talking about neoliberal capitalism, is that to me is the most insidious toxicity that has been fed into the public domain because it makes us all powerless to corporate technological development. So we'd just love to have your comments.
Yeah, thank you so much for your remark, Jim. I think it's a very hopeful message that you shared. But I agree. I think one is sort of having people made aware of this. So I, for example, see this in my own university, where there's a lot of incentive and a lot of courses for how to use AI in your current life. But I mean, we can just say as a university or with a lot of teachers, like, yeah, well, we are just not going to do that. I'm not doing it. I'm stopping. And I think a lot of things and I sometimes think about this when I'm in the bus or going to work and see all this traffic, and I think, well, if we just for one day all think, well, we don't like the system, we're just going to stay home, will make such a big impact, but we just don't do it. But yeah, I think that's sort of how to sort of get this attention. But it's just this sort of what you described, this sort of feeling or sort of mentally incorporation that you can't do anything about it.
Yeah. It came up for me when we were hearing the report from Davos. Eddie Pyrick was in Davos talking about AI. And during the day, they acknowledged there's nothing you can do about it. The cat's out of the bag. So, but then at night, over drinks, they were anguished, right? But they had no intent of actually doing anything about it because their worldview is that you can't do anything about it, which legitimates the corporate machine. And when we talk about worldview, it seems to me that what humanity has to first get clear is that, yes, you can put the genie back in the bottle. We do it every day, and that's called civilization. But Philip, what would be your comment? Tom?
I think you have met very different genies than I've met. I would say nobody's ever succeeded in getting the genie back in the bottle, but we've succeeded in having a relationship with the genie, and that's different because you shouldn't be threatened by the statement that the cat is out of the bag. What you should be threatened by is the predicate that comes after that, which is that we can't do anything about it. And I don't think either Floor or myself actually used that statement. We said the cat is out of the bag. There's no way you'll ever be able to remove what we can do from the public domain. In a short period of time, you won't need a giant supercomputer to train your model, right? So in that regards, I say, okay, so how do we steer the genie, right? How do we steer the genie? I mean, and of course, somebody's getting the genie back in the bottle might be another person's half full cup. So I accept that there's gray areas here. But those people are sort of, it was probably false. I mean, bemoaning that they couldn't do anything about it. They're not, that's just false, falsehoods to help their karma, right? Because in the company standpoint, particularly like Google or some of the big players, they absolutely can make choices as to what to do and not do.
Exactly.
Right?
Google, Facebook, GPT chat, Microsoft got together.
Sure.
Tomorrow afternoon, they could at least begin to corral the genie.
Absolutely. Yeah. And give us some control and some input over the genie. Right. Yeah. What nefarious actors, and it's probably safe to say that some of these companies are just as nefarious as state nefarious actors might do with the technology is a separate question. But I think what I'm reacting to is to try to, we don't want to push against an immovable object. We want to be effective in our manner in which we approach to guiding AI towards being ethical part of our future, right? And it's only because I'm from the generation of abstinence-only education, and that never worked, right? So, so that's
You wouldn't have done well in prohibition.
Yeah, probably not, right? I live in Sweden. In Sweden, it works, right? Where you just say, don't do that. And then everybody says, oh, the government says, don't do that. We don't do that. But when I'm back in the US, it's not quite the same way.
Yeah, it's true.
But, but I also think that relying on these technologies, relying on some of these companies to do the right thing in any way, shape, or form is going to be a tough sell. And it's not just with AI, it's with climate and other large actions that these corporate actors can take to be responsible stewards of the world. And it seems like at most corners, they're just answering to the shareholders. But without a doubt, there are actions that they can take. But I think it's more up to us, as I was saying to Tom earlier, that as we educate people with non-classical engineering backgrounds, to democratize the use of AI in possibly a more ethical and broader context, to use it, essentially to make sure it gets used for the purposes that we think it should be used for, rather than saying we're not going to use it at all. There's the possibility of saying we're going to focus on uses that we believe or fit some definition of ethics, of our definition of ethics.
Tom, what's your view about the genie in the bottle?
For me, I think we've got a good example in the program we did last year on glyphosate. You have scientists working within Monsanto who are good human beings, and they're being asked to solve 4 specific questions. And they, as a company, and the individuals in those companies are just people trying to live their life. They go to work every day. They're trying to pay their mortgage. They're trying to get promoted. They're trying to get a bonus. They're trying to do what they do as parents or as citizens. And they've created a repurposing of a poison to be used in something called Roundup to kill weeds in fields. And Monsanto lost over a $10 billion, had over a $10 billion settlement, and yet there's still people working for Monsanto that's now owned by Bayer. There's still Roundup on the shelves in stores. People are still buying Roundup and using it in their gardens, using it in their lawns, and killing the soil. And so there's somebody put in the chat, there's a dance going on with the genie. And I think that's the challenge we have. We do all have personal choices that we can make. And we have to decide, how are we going to spend our money? What companies are we going to buy our products from? How are we going to spend our time? How are we going to show up in the world? And, that genie might be out of the bottle, and maybe it's not possible to get it back in, but we do have a choice on many of the decisions we make on a daily basis. And I guess that's where I am, is that in that dance with the multiple genies that are out there.
Well, good. Let me just bring in what Cuff Ferguson just asked, which I think is a real good question for Floor and Philip. How would you incentivize, let's say, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, GPT chat, cluster of companies to come together to do the right thing? Floor, if you were sort of dictator for a day, how would you incentivize these corporations to do the right thing? And Philip would love to hear from you.
Wow, yeah. How I would incentivize, very specific. I think have these people that are in charge of the direction of the company, and even though it's maybe a lot of people, maybe having, I think what's also having what you mentioned, like people in their personal life and people in their sort of corporate context. I think for a lot of people that sort of changes their mindset a little bit. Like if you maybe would ask them about a personal question, they would think differently than in a corporate setting, perhaps, because it has a lot of different ways of sort of you have other goals there, perhaps, if you're in a work setting, or maybe I think maybe, and then let them sort of be as a human. Really, it's like there's not any consequences, but just let them think about it's possible to do something right now, not for the corporation, not for like business goals, not for shareholders, not for whatever, but just as a human, would you make this choice to right now, like on paper, you need to sign this, and I don't know, like something to let them reconnect with their
So you would just
compassion.
remind them that they're human.
Maybe, yeah. I don't know. I find it very
You would
difficult.
start with basics.
Yeah. Yeah, but
Philip, what would
yeah.
you do? What would you do, Philip? How would you incentivize Google to come to the table?
Yeah, I mean, my personal belief is that once a company is a public company, you are then beholden to the shareholders, and that currently only means one thing, which means there's no way for them to take, a holistic view and not have a bean counter decide that it's more expensive to do so. There was once upon a time when it was a small company that had a do no evil, motto. You may remember that from Google, and that was shortly before they helped China build the Great Firewall and a bunch of other things when they finally flushed out the idea of do no evil. So, I mean, I can only think that these type of corporations can just not, they can't be public, and then ultimately you have to rely on the decency of the individuals that are running them and sort of convince them that somehow they should pay attention to not everything around them that's telling them they should make more money. And I don't know how to do that. I do know that as long as their answer to the shareholders, these days the number of retail shareholders is just as large as institutional shareholders. And I mean, as we've seen, there's backsliding going on in diversity and inclusion right now, much less, equitability and ethics. So I don't see any other way other than a couple of these big companies need to be broken up, turned private, and the people, and they can't necessarily control all aspects of the information, because Facebook is, for example, they're just as responsible for creating the content as they're training on, et cetera. So, but as far as incentivizing them, I think if you solve that question, you get next year's Nobel.
Well, I'm going to nominate Tom to answer the question so we can nominate
If
him.
anybody can do it, Tom can.
Yeah, Tom.
I go back to a conversation we had last year with Charles Eisenstein and Jojo Mehta. Jojo is the executive director and co-founder of an organization called Stop Ecocide International. And she's been working for quite some time now to have the International Court in The Hague recognize ecocide as a crime against nature and have the same legal standing as genocide. And as she shared on the program, publicly companies are fighting her to prevent this from happening. And privately, the CEOs of these companies are saying to her, please keep doing your work, protect us from ourselves, protect us from the systems. There's a list of 100 companies that will be brought up on ecocide charges when it becomes enacted in law. CEOs of those companies will be brought up personally on charges of ecocide. And they're saying to her, you're doing the right thing, make it happen. But publicly, the system doesn't allow it to happen yet. And I would hold AI in that same frame. We've got many examples where privately the CEOs want the right thing to be done, but the system doesn't allow for it. And so it fundamentally will require a change in the system. But I don't know where that comes from. Ultimately, it needs to come from the individual citizenry. But if we don't believe we have a voice, if we don't believe we have the ability, then it's not going to happen there.
Hmm.
And Tom brings up a good point, Jim, about, sort of an incentive can be positive or negative, right? And in one side, we're like, how do we incentivize them? The other question is there any punitive pressures that can be applied over time where harm can be proven in the same way that that these people are looking to bring up these companies on ecocide charges, right? This sense of piercing the corporate veil and holding people responsible for, either individual or large scale damages done by AI or putting people at disadvantages. I mean, that's something that the courts, I don't think there's been any major challenge to that as of yet, but certainly we would expect there would be. And the question is, who do we hold responsible for that? And possibly holding the corporate directors responsible is a tool. We don't have a huge history of sort of corporate oversight in the US, so hopefully Europe will do a better job at that, right? But there's both carrot and stick, but I don't think there's a big enough carrot at these points.
Yeah, and maybe the stick is also like for the like if it comes down to shareholders and for big corporations, I think just the fact that it's possible to have that much money to one single person or to a couple person, it's also create this incentive for these people to stay in power. So I think having that much money in the first place is quite unethical, and it also creates this kind of greed and sort of power to shareholders and to keep this in a system. So I think even just having a maximum or just taxing the really rich very heavily would already sort of perhaps help in that sense.
Well, Andrew Bailey is adding boycott the suckers. Thank you, Andrew. I love your turn of phrase. So, Tom, why don't you give us a summarizing comment and then tee us up for tomorrow?
Yeah, I first have to thank Flora and Phil for being with us today. I really appreciate the perspective you both have on this, and really appreciate you being with us and sharing your thoughts. So a big thank you to you both for being with us. This has felt like an important part of the conversation. We can't ignore that AI is operating, and the creation of AI is operating in the capitalistic ecosystem that we're living in. So I'm grateful for you both for spending time with us today. Tomorrow we're going to shift our focus to, we've got a couple of folks joining us to share their experience of using AI to support the development of humanity, particularly compassionate AI, and some of the tools and the technologies and work that's being done. So, the evolution of this week has very much been to point out where are we with AI, as scary as that is. What are the questions that are not being asked? What are the questions that need to be asked? And we'll finish the week with compassionate AI tomorrow, and then just some perspectives of parents of young children who work in the technology sector and have a chance to explore parenting in the world of AI. So thank you all for being with us today, and for those of you who've been able to join us for the week.
Yes, thank you, Tom. Thank you, Philip. Thank you, Fleur. Kim Kerrigan said today is one of the best, deepest, and most ethical discussions about AI so far. So you've brought, deep wisdom and real illumination to what all of us, I think, understand is a very complex issue. We don't really even know what the genie is in this case. That's the truth about AI. And because we don't know what that is, we don't even know what the bottle is. We're really being challenged in very, very fundamental ways. And so we've appreciated your humility of intellect as we've approached this very complex matter. It's been very, very illuminating to our global community. So that'll bring our program to a close. You're all welcome to the after session chat. You'll see the link in the chat box. You received it in your Zoom reminder for the call today. And then we'll see everyone here tomorrow for a further discussion of AI in terms of compassionate usages. Thank you, everyone. Bye for now.
Thank you.